Sure. All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Retro Report and welcome to City Limits panel Mapping the Future, a discussion about planning in New York City. I'm Jarrett Murphy. I'm the executive editor at City Limits. We're so glad you could all join us, and we're hoping we can have a great discussion here tonight. City Limits, as I'm sure many of you know, is an excellent publication, if I must say so myself, and it's a very fun place to work. And so because of that, yesterday we took a staff outing to Williamsburg and had a tour by a very knowledgeable guide of that neighborhood, talking about history, past, distant past, and more recent past. And we walked down to the end of Grand Street, where it meets the river, and to a little kind of dusty patch of territory. And I distinctly remembered being there in 2005 to cover a protest of the Williamsburg Greenpoint rezoning. And I remember that day very clearly. It had all the hallmarks of old Williamsburg. There were people dressed as flowers. There was a kind of ragtag band. There was the Reverend Billy Talon from the Church of Stop Shopping with a megaphone. And it is emblazoned in my mind. And of course, at that point, when I was 29, I did not think that I'd be covering rezonings for the next 14 years, probably because I thought my career might have a different trajectory. But I certainly would have been surprised to note the echoes between the discussion that day, the arguments that day, and the rezonings we've seen since under Mayor Bloomberg and under Mayor de Blasio. And that is surprising just because of the difference between that time and now, and that mayor and now. You have a different mayor, different ideologies, different marketplace, different tools, mandatory inclusionary zoning versus voluntary inclusionary zoning, and frankly, different approaches to engagement to some degree, how much of the community's voice comes in at different points of the process in crafting a plan. And what I think is also interesting is not just that you hear complaints, because you hear complaints about everything in New York, but that the content of the complaints is so similar. Concerns about certainly density and change, which you hear about a lot of stuff and is legitimate, but also concerns about affordability and displacement, whether the city is being honest about keeping promises it made in the past, whether there are adequate services in place to deal with the changes that the neighborhood's going to undergo, concerns about equity, and again, what's the role of the community voice in the process? What does it mean to be engaged? What does it mean to have some say in shaping your future? Now, we could dismiss that, all of that, as just the standard noise that attends development in New York City, just part of the territory, except that we know more now than we did 14 years ago. I know a little bit more. Many of us know a lot more. We know that the homeless shelter census indicates the severity of the affordability crisis. We know that the transit system is suffering from a lot of ills, not just financial, but also about the strength and resiliency of that system. We know that Rikers is closing, and some neighborhoods are being asked to take on a different kind of task and others aren't, and there are questions about fairness around that. And of course, we know that climate change is coming in a way we did not really talk about 14 years ago. We know a little bit about what it's going to mean, but it's an evolving, multifaceted, and obviously very severe threat. So all of this alone would be reason to have a conversation about how New York City confronts and plans for its future, how well it does with its current system, if there are other ways to do it differently. It's especially important to talk about that because this year the Charter Revision Commission process gave an opportunity for people to look at a lot of aspects of how we govern ourselves in the city, and planning was one of those. So that's one of the reasons why we're here tonight to have this discussion, and I'll introduce our panelists shortly and we'll start talking. Just some housekeeping notes. In order to maintain a good flow of our conversation, we're going to work your questions into it as much as we can, because otherwise we say we're going to have a Q&A at the end, and that's when we have 5 minutes left and one person gets to talk. So you've been equipped with index cards on your seats. Those are not for paper airplanes. Those are for writing intelligent questions, which I know you'll give. And once you're done with those questions, just raise them up and we'll have staff circulating to collect them. Also, I've been told by my social media guru that if you want to tweet about this event, and I hope you do, the hashtag is Mapping the Future. Mapping the Future. We wanted to make it as long as possible. And also, if you have not yet tapped into it, the Wi-Fi here is Retro Report Guest, and it's mirror, 2 capital M's. So, without further ado on the housekeeping front, let me introduce our panel. Starting at the end, we have Zachary Bernstein, who is a partner at Fried Frank's Real Estate Department and a member of REBNY's Zoning and Design Committee. Let's clap for him. This is not in order of seating. This is in order of how I wrote it, because it's alphabetical or being fair. Emily Goldstein is the Director of Organizing and Advocacy at the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. Clap, clap. Brad Lander is a member of the New York City Council representing the 39th District in Brooklyn. Sandra Lobo is the Executive Director of the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition. And full disclosure, Sandra and I went to college together, although she's much, much older than I am. So, and Stephen Smith is a member of Open New York and tweets at Market Urbanism. So many of you will know many of the names I've just said, maybe all of them, but I think it might be helpful for all of us to find out kind of how people come to this conversation. So starting with Zach, I'd like to talk about a little bit about what's your experience with the city's land use and planning process been for you personally? What have you seen of it?
Okay. So I'm a land use attorney. I represent owners and developers. I help them understand the thousands of pages of New York City zoning and what can be done on a given property, and help to demystify some of the ongoing EULA processes that might be going on and run by the city, or advise people on what might be doable on their own if looking to endeavor into the labyrinth of EULA and SECRA. So some of the clients that I have are Trinity Church, which has a lot of real estate holdings in Lower Manhattan, the Archdiocese of New York, which has a lot of real estate holdings all over the place. Tech companies such as Google, which you've seen have been establishing a campus on the west side, as well as more standard real estate owners and operators such as Essel Green and Vornado. And so I've been doing this since around 2004. The first project I was involved in was IKEA in Red Hook, which was a very interesting project, which involved, like many projects today, going out to the community early, understanding what the concerns were, integrating some concerns into the project, but a lot of issues came together in the rezoning and special permits there around maritime infrastructure, public access, economic development in the local area, issues that run through every rezoning, run through all land use conversations in New York. Some other initiatives I've been involved in that cut across other interesting issues was Trinity's rezoning of Hudson Square, looking at what was seen to be antiquated manufacturing zoning, and how do you balance keeping an existing job center while creating a live-work community in a neighborhood, while facilitating affordable housing and schools. And, many of the issues, again, that run through all of our conversations about land use. And more recently, I represented Essel Green, and it's an ongoing project you see rising not far from here in the One Vanderbilt project, precursor to the larger East Midtown rezoning, looking at how we can revitalize office stock in Midtown while also attending to the needs of transit and pedestrian flow and other things in the area. So that's a basic overview of my involvement.
Brad? Oh, go ahead.
Good evening. Thanks, Jared. It's great to be here. Good to see a full room. My name is Brad Lander. I spent 10 years as the executive director of the Fifth Avenue Committee, a not-for-profit in Brooklyn that does tenant organizing and community planning, and also affordable housing and community-based economic development. In that capacity, I both shepherded some projects through the city's Uniform Land Use Review process and UDAP, the sort of accelerated version of that, all exclusively for affordable housing. Toward the end of that decade, the first Bloomberg administration rezoning was of Park Slope, and the idea was there would be sort of a deal that most of Park Slope would be have contextual height cap zoning, essentially down zone to protect from out-of-scale development, while 4th Avenue would be up zone to allow additional development. And our idea was, as long as there was some affordable housing in the new development, that actually seemed like a reasonable trade. But at that point, prior to the Greenpoint-Williamsburg rezoning, the answer from the Bloomberg administration was no, not even voluntary inclusionary housing. So what has gone up on 4th Avenue since then is exclusively market rate housing, although now 2 homeless shelters, which we can come back to, not as a result of the zoning. Angered by that, I joined together with a lot of community organizations around the city to push at a relook at the non-affordability in our zoning, to think differently about inclusionary housing, to push to change the 421A program. And I went over to lead the Pratt Center for Community Development. So for 5 years, worked with community-based affordable housing, economic and environmental justice groups around the city, fighting for the community a better shake for the point of view of preventing displacement, finding affordable housing, thinking about what neighborhood needs look like, paying attention to environmental justice and sustainability. And we did that in Greenpoint Williamsburg and Hudson Yards and many other in the South Bronx and a lot of the rezonings of the latter part of the Bloomberg administration. And then in 2009, I ran for and was elected to the city council, where I have been for 10 years. In that first term, I chaired one of the subcommittees of the council's land use committee and have served on the land use committee for most of my time in the council, so seen a lot of projects going through. And most specifically, currently, we are moving forward on the Gowanus neighborhood rezoning, which we started working on in 1904 when the dissolved oxygen content in the canal hit 0, and are still working on it. And I'm glad we didn't do it earlier, because without tools for affordable housing and strengthening manufacturing and getting real sustainability and protecting tenants from displacement and preserving a genuine mix of uses, I would be opposed to it. I think we have the tools to do it right, and some of that motivates how I think about what we need to do more broadly in the city.
My name is Stephen Smith. When I moved to New York, I was a reporter. I wrote about real estate planning and transit for a couple of publications, including the New York Observer. And since then, I'm no longer a reporter. My day job, I work in real estate. I work at a real estate startup, and we do some principal investing, some brokerage. I primarily focus on the outer boroughs beyond the gentrifying fringe, anything from, work with primarily land, work with developers building anything from supportive housing, affordable housing, market rate housing, commercial development, industrial development. And I am here today representing Open New York, which is a YIMBY group. We advocate for more housing production in the New York area, specifically in high opportunity neighborhoods in the city and in the suburbs.
So I'm Emily Goldstein. My background is in tenant organizing. So I spent years working directly with tenants in rent-stabilized, Mitchell-Ama, and HUD-subsidized housing who were trying to maintain affordability in their buildings, who were trying to get to a place of decent habitable conditions in their buildings, and working with them both sort of at the local building level and in campaigns to try to find legislative and policy solutions to basic issues of affordability and displacement and conditions around the city. More specifically on land use over the past 5 years at ANHD, I did some work with our work around trying to preserve industrial land and trying to ensure that there would continue to be space in the city for good career-oriented jobs that are accessible to low-income people, immigrant communities, people of color, folks without necessarily higher education but who want to be able to have family-supporting jobs, and looking at that from a land use perspective. I did a lot of work to build up our rezoning technical assistance program at ANHD, which has now worked with about 15 community-based organizations in 10 different neighborhoods all over the city, providing strategic advice, technical support, a whole variety of sort of backup and assistance to local neighborhood-based organizations and coalitions that have been engaged in campaigns at the local level around the various de Blasio rezonings, and some of them around their own community-based plans and rezonings that they're affirmatively trying to move forward. I was also involved in our work around the mandatory inclusionary housing campaign, particularly trying to push for deeper affordability restrictions and sort of shift the balance of that program, and am currently doing a lot of of work with the Thriving Communities Coalition, which is a coalition of community-based organizations, policy groups, technical assistance providers, and legal assistance groups that came together, particularly in response to the current Charter Revision Commission, but have wound up sort of more broadly working together to promote a platform around equitable development, around land use reform in a variety of ways.
Let me take the mic. Yes, sorry.
Good evening. My name is Sandra Lobo. I am the Executive Director of the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition, and we are celebrating our 45th year this year, and we were created in response to redlining and disinvestment in the Bronx. And so for the last 4.5 decades, we've organized around racial and economic justice, on campaigns around safe, affordable housing, equitable economic development, environmental sustainability, immigration reform, et cetera. And just in connection to land use, the Northwest Bronx was involved in a 25-year campaign around the Kingsbridge Armory. And most recently, which I'd like to focus on this evening, is our 3.5-year involvement around the Jerome Avenue rezoning. And so that really allowed our community members and our leaders to really get a sense of the ULURP process, its challenges and weaknesses, as well as its opportunities. Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Sandra, let's stay with you and with that topic, since you mentioned an actual on-the-ground effort you were involved in, the Jerome Avenue rezoning. How do you assess the process? And let's start with the positive. What do you think worked well? What did you see as the opportunities it presented? What worked well in that process for you and your members?
I was trying to be optimistic, actually, thinking about the opportunities. I actually forgot to mention Northwest Bronx is also a part of the Thriving Communities Coalition with ANHD. I don't know how much I have to say about the positives. I do think from our end, we really had an opportunity to develop grassroots leadership in our neighborhoods, right? So we spent 3.5 years really ensuring that our community members understood the process, they understood the various stages of the ULURP process, and really supported them to identify the challenges, the needs that they needed in our community, and to develop the platform in order to further their interests and the resources that they needed for our communities. I think for us that was probably the biggest opportunity in that process. The experience was really, really challenging. I mean, everywhere from the very beginning in terms of what does community engagement look like in the process, what's actually put in place, to the level of communication between city agencies, elected officials and community members, to the limited analyses that's provided in the scope and in neighborhood studies, what they decide to include, what they decide not to include, to the environmental impact statement, right? And there is a lot of pieces there that were really challenging for us, despite bringing out thousands and thousands of people throughout that 3.5 years, kind of providing both qualitative and quantitative data about the impact of the proposed action. The eventual EIS statement was still very limited, and decided to exclude things like, and I don't know if this is the place to go into detail, so just stop me if I keep going, not including rent-stabilized tenants, right? That was our biggest challenge, I think, in our neighborhood in Community District 4 and 5. We worked collaboratively with CASA, which is another organizing group in the area, and the work that we were doing before the rezoning campaign began was supporting tenants to fight illegal evictions, to fighting illegal harassment, fighting increases in rents, fraudulent fees, all of these things that were already happening on the ground. All of those testimonies, all of that data collected was put forth to the various folks in all of the various stages of ULURP, and at the very end, the EIS decided to exclude rent-stabilized tenants, despite the fact that the city is investing and continues to invest millions of dollars in legal services, because there is data that shows that these folks are being displaced and they're being illegally evicted. And there's a whole series of data that was decided to be excluded and not included in the EIS, as well as, thinking about what, if you don't collect the right data, if you don't provide the right analyses, and then therefore the mitigating response will be limited as well. And so I think for us, from the way in which community was engaged all the way until the recommendations and the ultimate decision was really challenging for our community.
I'm glad I asked for the positives. So Zachary or Stephen, do you want to weigh in? How do you assess the current process, and do you see elements of it that do function fairly well?
Before I answer that, can I just ask a question of Sandra? I guess, I understand the reason that the analysis is done that way. It's partly assuming that there are laws in place that protect certain people, but the obvious point that's being made is that those laws are not always functioning properly. I guess I would ask, if you had a higher level of confidence that the rent laws were being properly enforced or properly respected in the area, how would you or your coalitions feel about the general goals of the rezoning?
So that would be illegal displacement. So that was not included in the EIS. But what was also excluded was a variety of even legal displacement. So thinking about the kinds of residential spaces that were excluded, if there's commercial space that's currently occupied, that's also not included. They did not include any residential buildings that are underutilized, so like they're not exceeding their total FAR, so they didn't exclude that. There's a whole series of data points that were judgment. There were statements of judgment by the writers who decided to do that, which, if we look at the manual, actually gives the manual states that it's guidance, right? It's not law, and so that depending on the neighborhood trends, that you can look to see what's going on in that neighborhood, and that should be incorporated into the environmental impact statement. That was not done in our case in Jerome Avenue rezoning. So even if we had full faith that the laws in place would prevent displacement, there are plenty of things that were not included in the statement that we know will be displacing folks, right? So you only have to go into more detailed analyses in a neighborhood if you are displacing 500 or more residents. The decisions that they made to decide what you're going to include and what you're going to exclude only said they were going to displace 16 or 19 residents. We don't believe that's happening, right? We don't believe that's true, and that's reflective of the reality on the ground, both in anecdotal, qualitative data, as well as quantitative data that we see in the courts today.
Okay, so it sounds like you can't even get to the question of the merits of a proposal if you don't have a level of trust in the way it's being done. That's fair. So what I was going to say, aside from the specific environmental review technical analyses, is generally speaking, from a developer's perspective, my client's perspective, I think the process works pretty well. While granting that I understand there's not a level of trust in all of the areas of environmental analysis, the general setup where ULURP involves a process going through different stakeholder groups, and at the end is the legislative body and the local elected official that essentially has veto power over the action. From a developer's perspective, that's a lot of leverage at the end, and is a big motivation at the beginning to identify potential pinch points and identify areas where the proposal may not succeed at the end of the day.
So there's a lot of desire, I know, from a lot of activists for there to be, more studies of the impact of development of rezoning. But I think that we have to admit that the impacts are not exactly known. If you go into the academic literature and you see, what happens when you build a building in a neighborhood, does the rent go up? Does the rent go down? There's not a lot of studies on it. There's like a small handful. I think there's maybe 2 of them that are, peer-reviewed. There's a bunch that are, not peer-reviewed, maybe, not at the same standard. The literature really disagrees. It comes to a lot of different conclusions. So, there's people on both sides who want actually study. There's people who say that, if you really study it, you'll find that, building more in a neighborhood will make the rents go up. It'll make the rents go down. And if you have the Department of City Planning trying to, parse, you have 3 papers, they don't really study the exact same thing. One of them is not peer reviewed. How do you come down on it? So I think we should have some humility here and say that the truth is people feel very strongly on both sides about what the impact will be. But, if you ask an academic, what is the consensus, they will say there is no consensus.
Just want to remind folks, if you've got a question, write it down, throw it up. We have people collecting them, want to work them in. Emily, you can address those. You look as though you're ready for a question.
I have something to say to that.
I know you want to. In addition to whatever you want to say, can you address, too, we've been speaking here, obviously, about neighborhood to neighborhood. Pull back a little bit. How well does the system do at dealing with broader needs beyond block by block, building by building?
I'll start with that, right? And sort of in response to 2 things. So part of what happens in the current process is that a lot does come down to that moment of leverage at the end with a single council member, right? And there is a lot that gets tied to the rezoning process that has nothing to do with zoning, right? That doesn't even necessarily have to do with new development, right? So you have rezonings happening where a school that a community's existing population has needed for 10 years, has been fighting for it for 10 years, and has not been able to get, winds up being the thing that sort of makes the deal work at the end politically, right? And maybe for the community or maybe just for the council member, right? You have a lot of conversations getting conflated into one, right? And you have existing needs and projected future needs. You have local needs and citywide needs all being talked about in a mush together, right? And what that winds up doing is exacerbating existing power relations and existing power imbalances between richer and frankly whiter neighborhoods and poorer and primarily community of color neighborhoods, which are that way because of a long history and because of redlining and because of disinvestment, right? Because of all the history that brought us to the city we currently actually live in, right? As opposed to a city where everyone theoretically would be on an equal playing field. People are coming into what is functionally the same process each time from very different places and with very different needs and with very different sort of ability to make use of that leverage in the process, right? And what we wind up seeing, and this was actually said out loud in a council hearing a little while back, is that there's a lot that never makes it to that point in the first place because communities that are just going to say no and that sort of have a level of ability to say no because they're doing okay as is, right? And so they don't have to trade a yes for something else that they feel they need, don't get approached to begin with most of the time, at least not with the city-sponsored rezonings, maybe some of the private developers. And so to come back to I'll stop talking in a second, but to come back to your point, I think what that means is that there are certain communities that are both trying to get their existing unmet needs addressed and that are being asked to bear the brunt of citywide growth, citywide need, particular perspectives that I might or might not agree with about, affordable housing development, market rate housing development, whatever, right? And there are other neighborhoods that are left alone and that are left to stay, in character, right? Or that have great transit access and are mostly single-family homes, right? And it's just not talked about in the same way at a comprehensive level because there is no real citywide planning.
Do you want me to frame this for you? Do you have something you want to jump in? I have a question, but it seemed like you wanted to. Okay.
Now I'm curious. I'll take your question.
Well,
if I don't like it, I'll go with the frame I was planning on.
There's been mention made of the council member at the end, which is obviously that's your role in this room, at least right now. And so that brings to the question of how much of this is about the system and its flaws or virtues, and how much of it is about the people operating the system. If you had a mayor, or if you have a mayor who is committed to planning the right way, to engaging people in the right way, if you have a council member who is doing the appropriate role of balancing citywide and local needs, does this system work all right? And isn't that kind of what every system depends on?
Well, I mean, if we were all socially generous and did long-term planning in our lives, if we could resist like eating the marshmallow, and if we loved sharing, maybe we would, and if we didn't have a system of government which dramatically overrepresented people who were desperate for ego gratification and power to be the societal decision makers, then maybe our current system would produce good outcomes in which we thought about the long term and were socially generous to others across lines of difference to solve common problems. But given the real world that we live in, the current system exacerbates our worst selves rather than our best selves. And I guess what I want to kind of, if you view it from the lens of the Jerome Avenue rezoning, and like that's where you start and you're thinking about getting to the council vote, I just submit to you you've lost the battle for a more thoughtfully planned, fairer, more sustainable, more inclusive city before you started. And that would surely be true if you knew the fact that of the 10 de Blasio administration mandatory inclusionary housing neighborhood rezonings that have either already passed or are in the process, 9 of the 10 are in low-income communities of color. And the 10th is Gowanus, which we could argue about whether that's like a white, middle, and upper-income neighborhood, but it's a lot closer than the other 9. And I would just say to you, like, if you knew you were in a city that had substantial displacement and rampant inequality and was highly segregated and was experiencing growth that was pushing people out, even if you had read Supply Skeptics by the Furman Center and were persuaded by the data that we have to build more and that actually new development does not significantly increase displacement because by the time it's economic to build, it's already in the incentives of every landlord in that neighborhood to push out all the low-income tenants. Even if you agreed with all of that, I think if you knew that we had done 9 of 10 of those rezonings in low-income communities of color, you would see we don't have a system that is currently capable of thoughtful and comprehensive fairness. If we had started from the beginning, and also, how would the residents of Jerome Avenue know why it was that their neighborhood was selected to be one of the places where growth was going to take place when there was no public process around why it would start in the beginning, no metrics or guidelines for which neighborhood, and it wasn't done in the context of thinking comprehensively about what the citywide needs are. So to me, it's like starting with, can we do something to deal with those pesky council members at the end who are just going to yield to NIMBYs or negotiate for their school and cave, one or the other? Like, that's what we're stuck with, right? It's just lose-lose. Like, we would have to start from, okay, what's happening in the coming decades in our city, and Jarrett talked to us about some of this, like rising sea levels and a warming climate, and growing affordability and inequality crises, and aging infrastructure, and continued growth. And then if you said, do you think our current reactive Euler process, where either individual developers will propose projects, or where a city hall with no public process will one at a time select neighborhoods, that will result with a process that looks or feels to anyone like it's fair and strategic, mindful of long-term planning and infrastructure investments, and with an eye toward the values we set together, it just couldn't possibly do it.
So speaking of the kumbaya moment you mentioned, could you pass the mic down to Zach Dan? He wanted to jump in.
Well, I understand you're talking about City Hall with no public process, and that may be a fair point, but the last 2 administrations did publish blueprints for what they thought was needed planning-wise, specifically on increasing housing supply across the city. And first the Bloomberg administration in Plan YC 2030 looked, and these are sort of obvious issues. Where is transit in the city? Where are the transit nodes that are underdeveloped? Those are the obvious places where new density needs to go in order to accommodate additional housing supply to ease the squeeze on rents in the city. And so this administration came in and was very public with their plans under Housing New York to also identify areas across the city where this growth could be accommodated. Now, I hear the point that 9 out of 10 are identified as being in certain neighborhoods, and that it wasn't a public process as to where they were going to go and when. And so there's work to be done, certainly, but I would say there hasn't been zero planning of that nature.
So speaking of the Housing New York plan, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was, and I strongly encourage all of you in your spare time to read the comments on the draft environmental impact statement for the Jerome Avenue rezoning. It's really riveting. It's really riveting. What we included in here was really kind of speaking to the Housing New York plan and saying, de Blasio had this really ambitious plan to produce more affordable housing. We out in the street have a chant, affordable for whom, right? So if you look at the average median income of the Jerome Avenue rezoning area, it's 30% AMI. That is not incorporated into this plan, right? So all of the majority of the affordable housing that will be created in the Jerome Avenue rezoning is not for the people who currently live there. In fact, it will be pressure to push them out. And so in the Housing New York plan, it really talks about encouraging and increasing diverse neighborhoods, and we believe that our neighborhood is already diverse. It's very, very diverse. In addition, the Community District 4 and 5 in the Bronx were already exceeding expectations on building affordable housing, and not just affordable housing that's not for our folks, but actually deeply affordable housing. So the Jerome Avenue rezoning will actually stop that and incentivize the higher levels of affordability that is not for our community. So, it's interesting that, we're saying it's for affordable housing, it's for this plan, except it actually undermined the plan, the original de Blasio plan. A really interesting piece, too, that I think maybe this will be connected to what we're talking about in terms of land use is, Jerome Avenue rezoning, Jerome Avenue area corridor has a really amazing auto industry, right? It's a very powerful, it's been there for decades, and it has some of the highest paying jobs in our community. Given that average median income is 30% AMI, which is under $25,000 a year, having $40,000, $60,000, $80,000 jobs is really critical. Well, the rezoning just decimated that auto industry. They're completely gone because of the rezoning, and there is no plan to take them anywhere else, right? And so that is for us not supporting diverse neighborhoods in our community.
Very quickly to Zach, I want to make 2 points that I think I assume, but a lot of people in the room don't know me. I mean, one, I don't fault the individuals who have been in the planning and HPD in either the Bloomberg or the de Blasio administrations, many of whom are people who are close friends of mine who I think are doing really good and hard work. And two, I am like a pro-growth progressive. We need to build a lot more housing in this city, and I do battle with lots of my friends in the tenant organizing and tenants' rights and affordable housing world who in some cases have become so understandably traumatized by displacement that the bar set for development is hard to imagine you could hurdle. And if we're going, so my only point is our current system is not serving us well if what we want to do is put something together that enables people to lean into better planned growth.
Can I just jump in with 2 quick points? One, I mean, to sort of just build on what Sandra was saying, if you want to say that the justification for where upzoning is happening is transit corridors and transit access, right, then you've got to ask why Forest Hills isn't being rezoned, right? I mean, I think there is always a reason we can find that a certain place is logical, but that reason is never being applied in a consistent way across neighborhoods and across the city. And if you want to think about, well, how can we incentivize more affordable housing, and we now have the tool of MIH, which I think should have been done differently, but that is a tool designed to be used in high-income neighborhoods, right, to get free, semi-affordable at least, housing out of the market without needing subsidy. And so far it's almost exclusively being proposed and put in place in low-income neighborhoods where the housing that would have been created would have been 100% affordable. So I'm not, and a lot of our members are affordable housing developers, so ANHD is by no means anti-growth, but it's a question of what kind of growth is happening where and who winds up benefiting from it.
So a question, we've been inundated with excellent questions from the audience. I want to start working them in. The floodgates opened. One question, and we've been speaking a lot about housing affordability and housing growth for good reason, but this question is about other elements of planning. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the current system in dealing with external costs of development, such as increased water and sewage usage and schools. We know housing is obviously a point of discussion. How about other infrastructure? How well does this current process do it in making sure that's in place? Zach, since you've, I mean, do you?
The council member who's deep in this right now.
It's really hit or miss, I guess is what I would say. Like for schools, there is a planning process. School Construction Authority does a serious effort to project where there's, what growth patterns are going to be, where the schools are already overcrowded, and where new development of school, where new school seats will be needed. Now, we even put money in. We have a really hard time coming up with sites. And one of the reasons we have a really hard time coming up with sites is that we don't build into our neighborhood rezoning process a tool to figure out at the front end where the schools would go. So we signal we're going to do a neighborhood rezoning. We set the reasonable worst case development scenario before we start the study that will tell us how many school seats we'll need on top of whatever the School Construction Authority already said. And of course, by then the land prices are bid up, and if we do, so it's harder to site the schools than maybe it would have been if we had integrated that School Construction Authority planning into some more coherent planning process. But for that, at least schools is one place where we do some projections, neighborhood by neighborhood. We think about how many we're going to need, how much it's going to cost, and somebody's responsible for trying to deliver them. We don't really do that on energy and electricity and the grid. We don't really do that on flooding and sewage. Transit is super difficult because we don't control our transit system. And so it is a pretty disconnected system between the infrastructure needed for growth and the land use planning process which drives it.
Before we move to some of the ideas for how to potentially improve the current system, I want to go back to Stephen and ask, you discussed EIS and how there can be some conflicting research on what impacts might be, but when you think about the process broadly, the Euler process that we currently use, given your YIMBY orientation, does it serve that well? Is the current process good at generating the kind of growth, the volume of growth that New York needs?
I would say no. If there's a really quantitative look. There's a really quantitative way to see how much cities are building, and that is the number of housing units being built per capita. And if you line up all the American cities, you have the Rust Belt at the way bottom, in some cases, declining housing stock. And then at the top, you have mostly Sunbelt cities, in Texas and Florida. You have some coastal cities like Seattle, and then way at the bottom of any city that is, even vaguely desirable is New York City. And it is like way down there. And then you look outside the city and it gets even worse. So Long Island, they might as well just impose a building moratorium because they essentially have a building moratorium. Westchester does as well. There's a few, especially low-income towns in southern Westchester that do build occasionally. New Jersey does a little bit better. And one of the reasons New Jersey does a lot better is because the state will often step in and override municipalities. There is something called the Mount Laurel Doctrine, which is primarily about building affordable housing. However, you can fulfill the obligations through, I think, as low as 10% affordable in your projects. And it does push some projects through. In New York, the state takes an incredibly hands-off approach. There are plenty of towns on Long Island that have not produced a single apartment, unit since I've been alive. There are probably neighborhoods in New York that are the same, in the city that are the same, certainly in Westchester as well. So I would say that, there's a lot of places that are confronting this challenge, and the ones that have been confronting it the best tend to have a heavy hand of the state step in. And, sometimes in California, there's, recently been this push for a very granular approach where they say, literally if you're within, a quarter, half a mile of a rail station and you are not a low-income community, you must zone for this sort of density. It failed, but, it'll probably come back. The state has also been stepping in and, little known, but the state of California has essentially abolished single-family zoning through their accessory dwelling unit laws. So basically every lot in the state, unless it's like, in a, mudslide zone, must permit a second unit, an accessory unit, something that's called granny flats or basement units. They're literally basements in California, but, secondary units. Another way that they do it in the Pacific Northwest, they have a tradition going back to the 70s of what you could call comprehensive planning. The state sets some guidelines. They say every municipality must accommodate a certain amount of growth. It's up to the it's up to the municipality how to do it. They often do it the same way that New York does, put it all in the low-income neighborhoods. But regardless, it gets built. And New York has none of that. If you are the town of Manor Haven and you do not want to approve any apartment buildings, you do not have to approve any apartment buildings. If you if you are, I don't know what's a relative. I mean, I guess the Bronx is relatively pro-growth, really. The council people there tend to accept rezonings. So if the administration wants to push rezoning in Jerome Avenue and the council member says yes, it'll happen. Southern Boulevard, it'll happen. Other low-income areas, Far Rockaway, it'll happen. So what I would like to see is the state step in. It's not happening. I mean, the only thing the state seems to care about right now is the rent control laws. But I would like to see the state step in and say it is unacceptable that we have a virtual building moratorium on Long Island. It is unacceptable that neighborhoods with excess transit capacity in southern Brooklyn are downzone themselves during the Bloomberg administration and are not taking any growth now. And set how it happens, whether it's very minute, within a half mile of a transit station you must allow densities of FAR 1 or 2, or whether it's they give each city a quota and they say you must zone it however you'd like. I have my opinion, but anything in that direction would be great. We don't have any leadership on that whatsoever from anyone in Albany. Not from the Republicans, not from the old school Democrats, not from the insurgent progressive Democrats. We have no leadership on anyone, and for that reason, I am very pessimistic about New York City's housing trajectory going forward. I think you can stave off rent increases in with rent control, but in the long run, we're all market rate tenants. Everyone's got to move out of their parents' place at some point, and they become a market rate tenant. At that point, everyone, people get divorced, people, situations change, and people need to move out, and they become market rate tenants. And if you are not building new housing, then those market rents will just continue to go up and up and up and up. And what really frightens me is in California, you finally saw action once it became to the point where, unless you have a six-figure income, you can't really buy a house anywhere in California, not even severely disinvested towns in the Central Valley. In New York, we're not there. My Uber driver the other day was talking about buying a home in Buffalo. Probably made $35,000 a year. So there is still places that are affordable, and my fear is that it's not going to be until the median home price in Buffalo reaches $250,000 that people actually care about the issue of housing supply. But maybe.
So that raises a question that someone in the audience has asked, which is, and obviously Stephen just answered this for himself, but who is doing this better? What system or other place, international or national, can we learn from? Emily, where do you look to?
I'm in New York. I'm born and raised in New York, so I've got that a little bit of a New York bubble. I mean, as we've been sort of trying to think in particular about what could comprehensive planning look like in New York, we have looked at Seattle as well as some other places that do versions of this, all of them flawed, right, but all of them leaps and bounds forward from what New York has. Seattle in particular has some interesting sort of equity metrics that they've worked in, which I think is an important sort of foundational aspect.
I'll add a couple. My friend Lisa Bender, who's the city council president of Minneapolis, just passed a comprehensive plan in which the city council of Minneapolis voted to eliminate single-family zoning for the city of Minneapolis. And she was pretty clear, could they ever have done that one neighborhood at a time? Of course they could never have done it one neighborhood at a time. What neighborhood would have been the first to say fine? So that's one. London has done a pretty good job of integrating transit planning. It's sort of higher level. They've got a different system, but they've been thoughtful about their relationship between their transit and their growth. And Paris, though certainly a lot of challenges, has done something pretty interesting, which is set a goal for increasing the footprint of social housing, either cooperative or land trust or their version of public housing. And they said, I think they're at about 15%, which is well double what we are here. And they'd like to get to 20 because they did some analysis of what they thought that would mean as sort of having more of a public option in the housing marketplace. So those are 3 additional places.
So someone from Thriving Communities Coalition, any one of the three folks up here from that or affiliated with that, could talk about the ideas for comprehensive planning that were made part of the Charter Revision Commission's consideration. Obviously, they have not moved forward those to this point, but what's the comprehensive system that you guys thought might work in New York City?
So I'll start, and then someone else can pick it up. So from our perspective, any form of comprehensive planning has to have a few basic things in place, and then the details can go a lot of different ways. One is that we think it's really important to set the goals at the outset, right? And to have those big picture goals be stated so that you have something to measure everything against and something around which the budgeting and the land use and the everything else, right, can get sort of oriented, and you can, are we moving forward or backward? I don't know. What are we trying to move towards, right? So for us, it's really important to put equity principles into the charter as the goals towards which the various aspects of planning should be happening. Second, it's really important that there be both a bottom-up and a top-down aspect. And the bottom-up aspect for us is that it's really important that we're honestly assessing and then addressing local communities' unmet needs. Those are going to be different in different communities, and not everybody, right, like not everything can happen at the same time, so there's got to be some evaluation of what's most urgent and how do we allocate our resources, but that happen separate from an assessment which happens a little bit more at this point of what are citywide growth projections, what are the sort of citywide infrastructure needs, those types of things, and then those two things can get combined into, okay, well, what actually needs to happen to both address local residents' existing needs and to plan for the future of the city as a whole. And then I think the last thing I'll say before passing it on, and I've sort of hinted at this, is that for us in particular, it's really important that budgeting and be incorporated, because part of what happens now, and I mentioned this earlier, is that there's a lot of things that really have nothing to do with land use that wind up in our land use conversations, right? And so part of what's important to us is that the plans for budgeting on how are we going to invest in infrastructure, where are we going to put schools, like it happens a little more on schools, but not on other areas, right? Where do we need to put a park? Where do we need to do massive investment because everything's going to flood in 10 years, right? That all of that be happening in a way that is aligned with our land use plans and other forms of planning.
I think the other thing we felt was important and thought was important in the sort of big, every 10-year comprehensive plan version that we proposed at the beginning of the charter revision process, but also think could be made to work given some of the language in the staff recommendation document, which envisions more of a kind of 4-year planning cycle, is we have a bunch of documents that are ostensibly forward-looking, that are forward-looking planning. They're not ostensibly. People put a lot of work into them. The One NYC document is like that. Every year somebody prepares the citywide statement of needs. Every year someone analyzes all the infrastructure in the Ames report. Like we do it a lot, but those documents are neither coordinated, but in a certain way maybe even more important, they don't have impact. They're not sticky. There is nothing that requires or really even incentivizes subsequent actions to be aligned with the planning that we did. So we offered a few theories for that. You know, if you were going to do it at big scale, you could try to do a comprehensive generic EIS and let subsequent actions draft off that EIS, but at a much reduced level, if you couldn't achieve what would be like a giant, obviously, EIS, you know, if you develop that plan, you could have some folks who decided are subsequent actions aligned with or not aligned with the vision that was in that plan, and those that were aligned with could sail through ULURP a little easier, and those that were contra the plan would have some extra hurdles put in the way. You could make the 10-year capital strategy a real document by putting in some of the things that were developed, and then have the 10-year capital strategy in each year auto-populate that year's capital budget, so things could be taken out, but at least they started there, so that community that had a promise would know it was going to show up. And so those are some of the ideas that we put out for how you could do something that pulled subsequent actions in the direction of the planning work that Emily talked about.
So Zachary, if we could pass the mic down, how does that sound from someone who works in the process now for developers? What do you think of that as a potential approach?
I mean, as I said, we already have some overarching strategic planning concepts, which are imperfectly, I guess, integrated. And I think part of it is that agencies tend to be a little balkanized, and also, frankly, it's a very complicated city to run, and the agencies are working on running their different subject matter areas from day to day, and keeping the potholes filled and keeping things moving. I just question how you get to the point of consensus on those sticky issues without running into the same parochial reactions that you get that may have been some of the impediments to doing rezonings in certain areas. It seems very challenging to enact it in that sticky way.
Stephen, yeah, please.
So, I mean, it's true that we do have a number of planning documents. I have a question, I guess for Brad or for anyone, which is traditionally in government, one government entity cannot bind itself. You cannot promise that you're going to do something and have it be a binding promise. You need something above you. Sometimes that, if it's city, it could be the state, it could be a charter, it could be a constitution of some sort. Almost every city other than New York has, in theory, a document called a comprehensive plan, and for the most part, they just sit on a shelf, and people cite it when it's relevant or when they want to, and when they don't, they ignore it. It has all these great words about equity and whatever, and then they do the same thing that New York does, which is build all the housing in low-income neighborhoods. Do you believe that the city can do this itself? Anybody, I guess, or do you think that somebody needs to step? So I noticed, in Minneapolis, Minnesota does have some mandates for comprehensive planning, and there's sort of a framework for how it should be done. In Seattle, obviously, the state of Washington had some very strong intervention there. Do you believe that a higher level should step in, or do you believe this is something that New York City can do for itself by itself?
So I wholeheartedly support a New York statewide, whether you think of it as fair share or comprehensive planning approach. I totally agree. I think what you said about Long Island is entirely true, and and I agree that would only come at the statewide level. So I'd be supportive of a statewide approach, whether it looked more like Mount Laurel or whether it looked like the 40B in Massachusetts or the statewide planning approaches that they have in California or Illinois or Rhode Island. They're all better than what New York has. None of them are perfect, but they're all better than what we have. In their absence, I still think the city could do better than we're doing. And I do think part of the idea, and I think I haven't thought about it this way before, but you've helped me think about it differently, is like the idea would be to use the citywide level to provide some mandate to the neighborhood level. And it's got to work both directions. Folks in neighborhoods that have unmet need a chance to say, here are the things we're going to be looking for. But again, I think the Minneapolis example is a good one. It's true Minnesota required them to do a plan. It did not require them to do a plan that abolished single-family zoning. And they just, no council member ever would have agreed in exchange for a park to be the first one to say, yeah, fine, in our neighborhood we'll switch to triplexes. It just never would have happened. Something about saying we have to try to plan together for the whole city if we think we're going to need X more units and the ability to make a set of infrastructure investments. We're going to say that at a higher level. Maybe we're going to say that before we decide every place where it goes, so at least we are somewhat tethered. And then it'll be a little harder. Will it be easy to get people to say, okay, in our neighborhood? No, but a little better. You imagine a speaker of the council. Right now, a speaker of the council is just dealing with each member one-on-one. In that process, let's say we said we need 300,000 more units, and let's say the administration or city planning had said, here's 15 places where we think growth would make sense to achieve those 300,000 units. And, council member 4 comes to the speaker and says, over my dead body. Now, maybe the speaker can let council member 4 out. Maybe 14 neighborhoods would be enough. But the speaker can't let all 15 council members out, or it won't be possible to achieve a plan that's actually leaning in. So it seems to me that using the city as the higher level relative to neighborhoods is good given where we are, because I think you're right. And I had a lot of friends in Albany many these days, but more than we used to. But at the city level, we do have some progressives pushing hard for something that is pro-tenant, pro-community, pro-equity, pro-sustainability, but also pro-growth. So I'd rather lean in while we have that. Hopefully that'll come in Albany someday, too.
We have a question.
We have more than one.
Antonio.
We have a question about fair share and the question of not necessarily where housing is placed and where growth is decided, but a city infrastructure that some neighborhoods don't want, whether it's a jail or a homeless shelter or a methadone clinic. What is unfair about the current approach, and how would comprehensive planning make it fairer? Because when you dig into it, there's always a rationale for why it should be there, and it's not we want to screw those people. It's near transit, or it's because that's where land is cheap, or it makes sense because X is next to Y. How do you get beyond that logic and make it fairer, even within a comprehensive planning framework?
Yeah. So the city's current fair share framework comes from the 1989 charter revision, where they at least tried for the first time to say we should, in all aspects, the things people historically don't want, like waste transfer stations, but also the things people do want, like libraries and parks, should have an analysis. City planning needs to look and say, what's the unit of measure we should be having, kind of where are they across the city, and when an application comes for one, there needs to be some analysis. The problem right now is those analyses, they don't even go online in most cases. They're like buried on paper in file cabinet drawers in the agencies, especially if they're contract sightings. And there's no easy way for the public to look at what was the measurement of analysis and how do we rank cities in neighborhoods based on fairness. So every single neighborhood which feels under siege from growth, whether it is or isn't, says no fair every single time. And I get why the city, as a result, has come to think of fair share as just another word for NIMBYism, because everyone always says it. But that's because we're not currently providing any transparency in a way that would actually, for you to call bullshit on meaningless fair share claims, and know the ones that were really true, so that if a neighborhood is in the top 10% of concentration of a thing, and the city's trying to cite another one there, it's clear, and it should be a little harder. And right now, it is not. So two things should be true here. This is where there should be some improvement in the sort of reactive nature of the system, which is to say it ought to be a little harder to cite something in one of the communities where it's already in the top 10% most concentrated of that thing, and it is not. And the land is cheaper in those places, surprise. And so things get over-concentrated there. And the de Blasio administration on homeless shelters and the Bloomberg administration on solid waste management did take some braver actions to try to do some fairer sightings, but those were very specific, and on the broader totality of sightings, the system is just not, it doesn't make it possible for people to see or deliver. If you had comprehensive planning, it would be one of the inputs, so communities could see it at the start, and presumably one of the goals would be if particular systems, some systems are not that inequitable. It turns out the schools, the libraries, and the police precincts, and the firehouses are pretty well distributed. So we are capable of it. If we wanted to say, let's have other systems look more like that, we'd set it as a goal at the front. We'd agree to it in the plan. We'd figure out the places it wasn't true. We'd put some money in the budget to move them. And hopefully at the end, we would evaluate and say, you know what? We made it a little less unfair.
This is a particular point, but one that a couple questioners have asked, and that's about landmarking. And how do you reconcile landmarking with growth, with equitable growth? It goes to the question of, what character do we preserve and what do we kind of abandon? Any thoughts on that, Stephen? I'm curious your thoughts.
So I see, there are a lot of pro-growth people who really hate landmarking. I see landmarking as the final step to encasing a neighborhood in amber. Just as an example, the first landmark district was in Brooklyn Heights. The second was in Greenwich Village. They were passed in the 60s. But what happened before that? In the 1961 zoning code, when we were zoning the city, specifically, I'll use Greenwich Village as an example. The Department of City Planning wanted to zone Greenwich Village R7, which at the time was a lot stricter than it is today, because technical reasons I won't get into. They didn't have quality housing rules. R7 is roughly the density of a late 19th century tenement. And some neighborhood activists, including a woman named Doris Dieter, who is still on the community board, including Robert Jacobs, which is the husband of Jane Jacobs, fought to get the neighborhood downzoned to R6, which is roughly the density of a mid-19th century townhouse. So, we're in the mid-20th century. They were built, at the time, they were building, early 20th, mid-20th century density, a density of roughly FAR 10. And, for these activists, not only were tenements too dense, not only were, what was being built at the time and what was being built in the early 20th century too dense, but even tenements were too dense. We had to go all the way back to, when the first houses in Greenwich Village, single-family houses, roughly 4 stories, and they got it downzoned to R6, and then they got a landmark district put on top of it, and I don't entirely understand why, because you couldn't build anything anyway in the village. You couldn't build anything anyway in Brooklyn Heights. So I have never really, there are some in Manhattan, but I rarely see landmark districts where you could have built much of anything before then anyway. I know that Rebney is very concerned about landmarking. I think that Rebney has really entrenched to the point where they really, at this point, represent the absolute wealthiest developers. The people building in the village and in Midtown South and wherever. And I understand for them, it makes a difference. It's like, well, this was a development site, now it's not a development site. But in the grand scheme of things, landmarking, like once you're talking about landmarking a neighborhood, you've already lost the battle. I mean, you can't build anything there anyway. That's my opinion.
We've got a couple. This is a great question. I think it's partly tongue-in-cheek. Wow, this all sounds so dire. Devil's advocate question: why don't all New Yorkers move to Philly and commute to work? I think it's partly tongue-in-cheek, but it does raise the question of the region and the state process that Stephen talked about in other states. Is this something that the city can do on its own, or would there need to be a regional mechanism to make sure that it's fair and that it works properly?
Can I address the Philadelphia question, actually?
Sure, please.
Because I kind of like that one. I'm from Philadelphia. It's a wonderful place. But, this idea that everyone should just move somewhere else, you're essentially saying, why don't you just go gentrify somewhere else? I mean, in Philadelphia, Philadelphia is still a relatively affordable city. The idea that, just move to Philadelphia, just move to Newark. I mean, there's people in Newark. There's people in Philadelphia. They're not really building much more housing there either. So, this attitude that people, New York is full, people should live somewhere else. There are people, I mean, you think the Bronx is poor. Look at North Philadelphia. Anyway, I'm done.
No, Philly has room.
Okay, so we're coming toward the end of our time. We have about 50 minutes left. So let's talk about kind of where we are now in the process. The Charter Revision Commission has come back with its staff report. It did not throw its arms around the idea of comprehensive planning. It did mention there are all these other planning processes that occur and wants to give them more teeth. Talked about some EIS changes. Brad, from a kind of political standpoint, has that train left the station this year? Is there still some chance of having that conversation? Where do we stand on trying to talk about incorporating a system like this?
Yeah. I would say there's a little chance. What the staff wrote in the report, I mean, it's really fascinating. I wish I had brought the language up with me, because they do say, there is a broad public perception that the current system is not working at all and no one has any trust or confidence in it. And there's all these reports that no one knows what they are or why they are, and they don't really matter. But I think, and then it says, we should align them better, communicate about them better, and make them meaningful. So if you took that seriously, I think you could. I don't know that we don't need a 10-year comprehensive plan. We could do the set of things we talked about in a 4-year planning cycle that took the zoning and planning report and made it more meaningful and aligned it with some of these others and the 10-year capital strategy and made them stickier. You could do that. My read on what they're probably going to propose is more let's put color-coordinated covers on all those reports and put them between bookends on a shelf and call it a well-aligned plan. And if that is what comes out, which is a slightly different timeline with some requirement that there's a chapter in each one that shows they read the other one, it is not going to give us a different system than the one we have now. I think that's probably what they are going to propose, but I am still pushing accomplishing and why I'm really glad we're here. And if, like, this is a hard thing to get a public groundswell about, and this is part of the challenge, is that, like, what there's a public groundswell about is, like, we hate it, don't do any more of it to us. And so the folks whose job is to steward a system amidst that are like, boy, we better not pay too much attention to that. Let's just kind of try to skate on by with what we have and not making too much change. I think that's likely what we'll do. I don't know if that's like a catastrophe, but I don't think it will serve us as well. Maybe we'll get a mayor. This goes back to your question. Like, you could imagine a mayoral candidate who would say inclusive and sustainable growth is critical to our future. Here's how we're going to do it. It seems unlikely that at the moment that's what, you know, a candidate running for election would run on.
Could you pass your mic to...
Yeah, I was going to mention the same point, Brad, and to the point that Jarrett made earlier. I think some of this is about who's in elected office and how you choose to operate, how you choose to approach communities, how you choose to approach planning. And so I think this has brought to life a very healthy conversation, a conversation that's been had many times over many decades in New York City, you know, going back to a 1969 master plan that was attempted. And these are conversations we need to keep having. And I'm hopeful it will be part of the conversation in the next election cycles, and that some of this conversation will be taken up, and you will have an administration, a next administration that keeps these points in mind and combines, I think, this tide of progressive activism while also being in favor of growth and having read the supply skepticism article, and we can all keep working together to have the process work better.
So meanwhile, of course, the city continues to grow and communities face that growth and the pros and cons of it. And so this is a very practical question. Our community board is currently considering creating a 197C plan, and the discussion, I guess, within that board is whether they're wasting their time, if it will be considered, if this is worth a board doing. This is obviously a mechanism for doing some, a form of comprehensive planning that is in the existing charter. What do we think about that? Are 197As, 197Cs, that sort of stuff, is that worth doing? Stephen?
Sorry, it's not really comprehensive planning. I mean, it's a community planning, but like if it were comprehensive, it'd be the whole citywide. I don't see I mean, not to leave my own opinions in there, but like, objectively, I just don't see a point in it. The city doesn't ever seem to take them into account.
I mean, I'll go like one step more optimistic than that, right? So, I mean, there's been a lot of frustration with these because I think most communities' experiences have been that they make them and then the city ignores them, or the city takes like one paragraph out of it and then does their own thing, right? In particular, you know, the Chinatown, everyone should take a look at the Chinatown Working Group Plan. I mean, this was like 100 different organizations, like the whole spectrum of like developers and small businesses and tenant, or like basically like everybody, every institution in Chinatown spent 6 to 8 years creating like a really thorough plan that DCP doesn't want to move, right? So that's an argument against. I would say a potential argument for is what's happening right now in Bushwick, which is it's not quite a 197A or C, but the local community board expressed interest in zoning changes, sort of invited DCP in, but said that they wanted it to be on their terms, and their local council members, Antonio Reynoso and Rafael Espinal, to their credit, set up like a genuinely community-led process that involved the community board, local organizations, block associations, and those folks have come up while working with DCP and other city agencies, their own version of a very comprehensive plan that it's now, you know, we're now sort of in the moment of seeing whether the politics have shifted a little, right? And whether there is now an opening for DCP to to actually move forward with what the community has painstakingly put together. So I would look at the Bushwick Community Plan, and I would keep an eye on like what happens there in the next 3 to 6 months. I don't know how it's going to go.
In a way, that's kind of a microcosm of the arguments against against comprehensive planning, which is that the city's too big, that it would be too costly and too time-consuming to do. Obviously, those are arguments made against comprehensive plans everywhere, particularly in New York. Does it make sense to have a plan that covers the Bronx and Staten Island?
Well, if it weren't for the fact that the seas are rising and the affordability and equality crises are growing and the city is going to keep growing and the dynamics that we have are for one local democracy, I guess you could look at it differently. But I just that seems like a really defeatist. I mean, I feel like the main reason we're going to keep doing it the way we're doing it is just there's a big status quo bias in a big complicated system like the one we have. It takes a lot of work. A lot of people work really hard to take care of it, and making significant adjustments to it that would take more work and that have some risks seem scary. So that feels to me like why this commission is unlikely to propose it. None of those risks really seem catastrophic to me. It's like, yes, it will take some work. Yes, getting it right to figure out how you don't have to spend years and years on it. You got to decide how deep you're going to go and get that level of analysis, but deadlines are really good for doing that. Our planners and our planning community are totally capable of something that a lot of other cities are doing. Yeah, you have to spend a little more money if it's a bigger place, but we do that on everything. Our school system's bigger, and so we could do it. It might actually enable us to grow smarter and fairer, and in ways that made more sense for communities. And at worst, some people would spend a little money and a little time on planning that didn't have big impact.
I also think, implicit in that question, and in sort of, I've heard that from Commissioner, from lots of folks, is a sort of assumption that the status quo may not be perfect or might not even be great, but is sort of okay. I think the status quo is leading us to a catastrophe, right? The joke about everyone moving to Newark or Philly, and I agree with you on that point, but also people are moving. People are getting driven out. People are moving back down south where their families migrated from 2 generations ago, right? People are moving to Yonkers, and now they're moving farther north. People are moving out to Long Island and living in basement. I mean, people are being pushed out already. We are, inequality is increasing. Segregation is increasing. The seas are rising, right? I think there's implicit in that question of, this other thing would be so hard. The unstated flip side of it is and right now it's not great, but it's sort of okay. I don't think that's true.
So, Sandra, last questions. You work in the Bronx, you're an organizer, you work with organizers. It sounds as though if this question is going to be dealt with, it's going to be dealt with down the road and require our political process to point in this direction. Is this an issue that resonates with folks who are involved with Northwest Bronx? And what kind of advice would you give to community organizations around the city, grassroots groups? How do you take this issue and make it something that we are going to force the system to address one way or the other?
Absolutely. It definitely resonates with folks on the ground and across the city, actually, because part of this work we've been connecting with partners across the city. One thing that really just stands out to me is already the movement that we've made to diversify community boards and to ensure that community boards have term limits and that they are reflective of different income levels in the community, and that is really critical. I think we're going to continue to do some organizing to ensure that there's actual power in community boards, right? In terms of rezonings, community boards had, recommend or don't recommend. There's no actual real power there, and oftentimes there was oftentimes community boards had no understanding of what was going on. Our folks went and attended the community board meetings from DCP that would present it only as this is going to be great for our community. This is it's going to be bringing all these great amenities that you've been wanting for so long, and without a community planner on board, board to really interpret and help, support a plan that is reflective of the needs of the community, that's a real challenge to have the community boards actually be a real reflection of what's happening in the community. And so that organizing, I think, is happening now and will continue to happen as one part of part of land use, right? And so we're going to be continuing to, thank you, look at those kinds of spaces where we can organize to shift and to create more equity.
Well, I want to thank everyone for being such a great audience. This has been called Mapping the Future. Mapping the Future is a section of City Limits website where we cover issues like this, and pretty soon we'll be coming out with a newsletter focused very specifically on this discussion and discussions around land use, zoning, and democracy in the city. So please look for that. I know many of you are City Limits members. It'd be great if even more of you became that. That's what helps us to do programs like this and continue our coverage of the city, and also helps us to make sure that we are in touch with people who care about the things we do. So please consider joining our membership program. I would be really remiss if I did not thank our hosts here at Retro Report for letting us use their super cool space, and also if I weren't to remind you that they have work to do and families to go home to, so we're asked not to mingle too long here. There are plenty of watering holes and other places in the neighborhood. Please find one. I plan to. And most importantly, thank the City Limits staff putting us together, and our incredible panel. Please thank them for their participation. Have a good night. Thanks very much.
Yes, I do. Strong. How are you doing?
Yes.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Good to keep up the good work.
Nice to meet you. This was fun.
Thanks.
Thank you.
It's they do like documentary.